The air inside the small, sunlit church buzzed with an almost sacred quiet. The congregation had just finished the final hymn, their voices still resonating faintly in the high arched ceiling. Father Emmanuel Harper, the church's newly appointed priest, stood at the pulpit, his rich baritone voice offering the closing prayer. Clad in his white clerical robes, he radiated an air of peace and authority, commanding the attention of the faithful. The service concluded, and Father Harper stepped down, exchanging warm handshakes and kind smiles with the departing congregation. It was a scene of harmony, a microcosm of what the world could be. Then, the sound of heavy boots against the tiled floor shattered the serenity. A uniformed police officer, towering and broad-shouldered, stepped into the sanctuary. His mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but his rigid posture and tight jaw told the story. He wasn't here to pray. "Father Harper?" the officer asked, his tone sharp and devoid of courtesy. "Yes, officer." "How can I help you?" Father Harper replied, his voice calm, though he noticed the tension tightening around the man's lips. The officer gave a tight nod, but didn't remove his sunglasses. "We've had reports about some suspicious activity here," he said, glancing around the church as if expecting to uncover a hidden crime scene. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" The priest smiled faintly, unbothered by the accusatory tone. "Of course," he said, "but may I ask what kind of suspicious activity you're referring to?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, his eyes flicked over Father Harper's dark skin, his clerical robe, and then back to the congregation. What few members still lingered behind. "Is this your church?" he asked, his voice dropping slightly, though the suspicion remained. "Yes, it is." Father Harper responded, his tone steady. "I've been serving here for 3 months now." The officer crossed his arms. "Interesting. We've had reports of unusual gatherings here, late night meetings. Wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Father Harper tilted his head slightly, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. He could feel the weight of the officer's unspoken words hanging in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. The remaining parishioners stood frozen, unsure whether to stay or slip out quietly. They glanced at Father Harper, their concern evident, but he raised a calming hand, signaling for them to trust him. "Late night meetings," Father Harper echoed thoughtfully. "Well, officer, this is a house of God. Our doors are always open. People come to pray, seek guidance, or find peace in difficult times. Would you like to join us one evening?" The officer's face hardened, his jaw visibly clenching. "I'm not here for sermons, Father," he snapped, his voice sharp enough to make a few onlookers wince. "Let's cut to the chase. We've received complaints about individuals loitering on the premises. Some of them were described as fitting certain profiles." Father Harper raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Certain profiles? You mean people of a certain skin color?" The officer stiffened. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," Father Harper replied smoothly, his tone unwavering. He stepped closer, not to intimidate, but to make it clear he wasn't backing down. "This church welcomes everyone, officer. If some people feel uncomfortable because of who walks through these doors, I'm afraid that says more about them than about us." The officer pulled off his sunglasses, his piercing blue eyes narrowing as he studied Father Harper. "Look, I'm just doing my job. If you're not hiding anything, you've got nothing to worry about." "Then perhaps you'd like to search the church," Father Harper offered, gesturing toward the sanctuary. His voice was firm, yet there was a spark of something else, something that made the officer hesitate. "Would that ease your concerns?" For a moment, the officer seemed caught off guard, unsure how to respond. But instead of answering, he let his gaze sweep over the pews, the altar, and the lingering parishioners. His silence was telling, and the tension in the room grew thicker by the second. The officer took a step forward, his boots echoing ominously on the tiled floor. His gaze landed on a young boy standing near the front pew, clutching his mother's hand. The boy, no older than 8, looked up at the officer with wide, innocent eyes. The officer's stare lingered a beat too long, and Father Harper noticed the mother instinctively pulling her son closer. "Are you sure you don't have anything or anyone here that doesn't belong?" The officer asked, his voice low but pointed. His tone dripped with an insinuation that wasn't lost on anyone. Father Harper folded his hands in front of him, his expression remaining calm though his voice took on a sharper edge. "Officer, this is God's house. Everyone belongs here." The officer chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "That's a nice sentiment, Father, but let's not get carried away. You can't just open your doors to anyone. That's how problems start." His eyes darted toward the boy again. "You never know what kind of people might be hanging around." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the small crowd. One elderly woman in the back whispered, "What's he trying to say?" while another parishioner quietly began recording the exchange on their phone, sensing the situation was escalating. Father Harper's jaw tightened ever so slightly, though he kept his composure. "Officer," he said, stepping forward until they were nearly face to face, "if you have a specific accusation, make it. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you refrained from making baseless implications about the people in this church." The officer smirked, leaning in closer. "I don't think you understand how this works, Father. I'm not here to debate theology with you. I'm here to make sure everything's in order." "And by in order," Father Harper replied, his voice like steel wrapped in silk, "you mean making sure no one here looks too different for your liking." The officer bristled, his smirk vanishing. "You've got a smart mouth for a priest, and you have a strong bias for a law enforcement officer." Father Harper shot back, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. The crowd, now fully invested, seemed to collectively hold their breath. The officer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Father Harper continued, his voice rising slightly so the entire room could hear. "You walk into this sacred space with suspicion and prejudice, assuming guilt where there is none. What exactly are you looking for, officer? Or should I say, who?" The officer's jaw tightened, his pale knuckles flexing against his belt as if debating his next move. He stepped closer to Father Harper, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the priest. "Fine," the officer said, his voice colder now. "You want specifics? Let's talk specifics. We've had reports of a tall black man, matching your description, seen around here late at night. People are concerned. They say it's suspicious, so I'm asking you, Father, what are you really up to here?" A wave of disbelief swept through the room. The parishioners, many of whom had grown to love Father Harper in the short months since he'd arrived, exchanged incredulous glances. Some whispered under their breath, others stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let the exchange play out. Father Harper, however, didn't flinch. He clasped his hands in front of him, his calm demeanor never faltering. "What I'm really up to, officer," he began, his voice steady and firm, "is tending to my flock, counseling the troubled, and serving this community. But I suspect that's not the answer you're looking for." The officer smirked again, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Cute speech. But words don't mean much when you're hiding something. So how about you show me what's behind those doors?" He gestured toward the hallway leading to the church's back rooms, his meaning clear. Gasps erupted from the crowd. An older man stepped forward, his voice trembling with anger. "You have no right to accuse Father Harper of anything. This man has done nothing but good for our community." The officer shot the man a glare. "Step back, sir. This doesn't concern you." "Oh, but it does," Father Harper interjected, his voice rising just enough to silence the murmurs. "It concerns every single person here, because what you're doing, officer, is more than questioning me. You're questioning this community. You're questioning our faith, our unity, and our humanity." The officer rolled his eyes. "Save the speech, Father. Are you going to cooperate, or do I need to escalate this?" Father Harper tilted his head, studying the man with a calm intensity that made the officer shift uncomfortably. Then, with a slight smile, he said, "By all means, officer. Let's escalate." The officer blinked, clearly caught off guard. "What?" I said. Father Harper repeated, his voice unwavering. "Escalate, call your backup, search the entire church, turn over every pew, every hymn book, every candle. Do whatever you feel you need to do to satisfy your concerns, but when you're done and you've found nothing, I'll be expecting a public apology. Not just to me, but to this congregation." The officer's face flushed as he realized all eyes in the room were fixed on him. His hand hovered near the radio strapped to his shoulder, but he hesitated, weighing the optics of the situation. Calling for backup to raid a church filled with families, elders, and children would not go unnoticed. The murmurs among the parishioners grew louder, their disbelief now shifting into quiet indignation. Father Harper stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't raise his voice, yet his words carried a weight that silenced the room. "You see, officer, the problem with searching for something where nothing exists is that it says more about the searcher than what's being searched for. What exactly are you hoping to find? Or is the act of accusing me enough for you?" The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not here to debate morals, Father. I'm here to ensure this community stays safe." "Safe," Father Harper repeated, letting the word linger in the air. "From whom? A man of God. Or perhaps the people who come here seeking shelter and solace, people who happen to look like me. That's not what I said. The officer snapped, his voice rising. "But it is what you implied," Father Harper countered, his tone razor sharp. He turned to the congregation, spreading his arms wide. "This officer has come into our sanctuary with accusations and suspicions, but no evidence. He has labeled me and perhaps others in this room as threats based solely on appearance. Is this the kind of justice we should accept?" The parishioners, emboldened by Father Harper's words, began murmuring their agreement. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, holding her phone up. "I've recorded everything," she said. "If you want to escalate, officer, we'll make sure everyone sees how you treat a priest in his own church." The officer's composure cracked for a moment, his eyes darting between the growing crowd and Father Harper. "Recording me without my consent is illegal," he barked. "It's not." The woman shot back, her voice steady. "And you know it." The officer glared at her but didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to Father Harper, clearly scrambling for control of the situation. "You're trying to make this a spectacle," he said, his voice trembling with frustration. Father Harper shook his head. "No, officer. You made this a spectacle the moment you walked in here and decided that I, by virtue of my skin color, must be doing something wrong." The room erupted in murmurs of agreement, the tension now turning into a quiet storm of defiance. The officer's authority, once intimidating, now seemed fragile against the collective strength of the congregation. The officer's expression darkened as the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their discontent fueling his frustration. Suddenly, he took a step forward, pulling out a small notepad from his pocket. "All right," he said tersely, his voice cutting through the noise. "Since you're so insistent on playing the victim here, Father, let's make this official. Name and ID." Gasps rippled through the congregation. The parishioners exchanged shocked glances, and one elderly woman in the back muttered, "This is outrageous." Father Harper remained calm, his eyes never leaving the officers. "Name and ID," he echoed, a faint trace of incredulity in his voice. "I've already told you who I am." "Well, now I need verification," the officer said, his tone defiant. "You could be anyone wearing that collar." A hush fell over the room. Even the children, sensing the gravity of the moment, grew quiet. Father Harper studied the officer for a long moment, his gaze steady and piercing, as if trying to see into the man's soul. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into his pocket and produced his wallet. He held it out, letting the officer take it. "You'll find my identification there," he said, his voice steady. "But before you open it, I want to ask you something." The officer paused, his fingers gripping the wallet tightly. "What?" he snapped. "Why are you really here?" Father Harper asked, his voice calm but firm. "You claim to be investigating suspicious activity, but you haven't provided a single piece of evidence. You came into this church, interrupted a peaceful gathering, and made accusations without cause. What are you hoping to find?" The officer hesitated, the question clearly catching him off guard. For a moment his tough exterior cracked, revealing a flicker of uncertainty, but then his expression hardened again, and he opened the wallet, pulling out Father Harper's driver's license. The room watched in tense silence as the officer scanned the ID. His lips moved slightly as he read the name aloud. "Emmanuel Harper, huh? Guess that checks out." He handed the wallet back, his movements stiff and reluctant. Father Harper took it without a word, slipping it back into his pocket. "Satisfied?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with quiet authority. The officer didn't answer immediately. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the glares and looks of disdain from the parishioners. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it, but instead of backing down, he made his next move, a decision that shocked everyone. "Not quite," he said. He pointed toward the hallway leading to the back rooms. "I still want to check what's back there." The congregation erupted in protest. "This is harassment," someone shouted. "You're out of line," yelled another. The officer ignored them, his focus locked on Father Harper. Father Harper raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "If you insist, officer," he said, his voice steady, "I won't stop you, but be warned, you might find something you didn't expect." The officer's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. Still, he squared his shoulders and began walking toward the hallway. The congregation watched, holding their breath, as he disappeared into the shadows of the back rooms. The officer disappeared into the dimly lit hallway, his heavy boots echoing against the wooden floors. The congregation stood frozen, their eyes darting between Father Harper and the hallway entrance. Whispers rippled through the crowd as they speculated on what might happen next. "Why's he going back there?" an older man asked, his voice trembling with indignation. "Father Harper has nothing to hide. A young woman whispered, her phone still recording. Father Harper remained calm, his hands clasped in front of him as if in silent prayer. "Let him search," he said softly, addressing the growing concern in the room. "He believes he's looking for the truth. Let's allow him to find it." The officer moved through the hallway, his flashlight scanning the walls and doors. He opened one door after another, finding nothing but neatly organized storage rooms, stacks of hymnals, and racks of choir robes. His frown deepened with every step. Finally, he reached a door at the very end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled out from within. Pushing it open cautiously, the officer stepped inside. He froze. The room was small, lined with shelves stocked with canned goods, blankets, and clothing. In the corner, a small table held a pot of freshly brewed coffee, several mugs, and a stack of plates. Seated at the table were two men, one elderly and frail, the other younger but visibly weary. Their clothes were worn, and their faces etched with exhaustion. The officer blinked, unsure of what to make of the scene. "What's this?" he demanded, though his voice had lost much of its earlier bite. Father Harper appeared in the doorway, his presence calm and steady. "This," he said, gesturing to the room, "is our outreach program. Every night, we open our doors to those in need, people who have nowhere else to go. We provide them with food, warmth, and a little dignity." The officer turned back to the two men, who stared at him with a mixture of fear and defiance. "These are the suspicious individuals you've been hearing about," Father Harper continued, his tone carrying a quiet strength. "People seeking refuge from the cold, looking for a meal and a safe place to rest." The officer's mouth opened, then closed. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. "I didn't know," he muttered finally, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. "No, you didn't," Father Harper said, stepping further into the room. "But you assumed the worst about this church, this congregation, and me, because it was easier than asking questions or seeking the truth." The officer's face reddened, a mix of shame and defensiveness crossing his features. "I was just doing my job," he said weakly. "And your job," Father Harper replied, his voice firm but not unkind, "is to protect and serve, not to profile or harass." The room was silent, the officer visibly grappling with his emotions. Behind them, the congregation had gathered in the hallway, watching the scene unfold. Father Harper took a step closer to the officer, his gaze steady but compassionate. "You came here looking for something wrong, officer," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "You assumed guilt before you saw innocence. You acted out of fear or prejudice, or maybe both. But let me ask you this. What would happen if you looked at people with the same dignity you expect for yourself?" The officer swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the priest and the two homeless men. The younger man at the table shifted uneasily, his eyes wary. The older man, however, leaned back in his chair, his face lined with years of hardship, but his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Officer," the older man said suddenly, his voice rough but steady, "you ever been hungry? I mean really hungry, not missed a meal hungry, but days without food hungry?" The officer looked startled by the question but didn't answer. "Because I have," the man continued, "and I'll tell you something. When you're that hungry, a place like this, it's not just a church, it's a miracle. It's the only reason I'm alive today." The younger man nodded silently, his hands trembling as he gripped his mug. Father Harper placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder before turning back to the officer. "These men, and many others, come here because they have nowhere else to go, and we welcome them with open arms, not suspicion, not judgment." The officer shifted uncomfortably, his authority dissolving under the weight of the truth. But before he could respond, Father Harper surprised everyone. "Officer," he said, his voice softening, "I'm inviting you to sit with us. Join us for a cup of coffee. Meet the people you assumed were a threat and listen to their stories. Perhaps then you'll understand why this church stands for something far greater than you first thought." The congregation gasped softly, their whispers filling the hallway. The officer stared at Father Harper, visibly torn between his pride and the unexpected offer. "You want me to sit with them?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "I do," Father Harper replied, nodding. "Because what's happening here isn't just about me, or them, or even you. It's about breaking the cycle of fear and prejudice. It's about seeing each other as human beings." For a long moment, the room was silent. The officer glanced at the two men, then back at Father Harper. The tension in his shoulders seemed to ease ever so slightly, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The officer stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, his eyes flickering with conflicting emotions, pride battling shame, authority clashing with vulnerability. The room held its collective breath as everyone waited for his response. Finally, the officer sighed deeply, removing his cap and running a hand through his hair. He looked at Father Harper, his face softening ever so slightly. "All right," he said gruffly, "I'll sit." Gasps rippled through the congregation as the officer hesitantly approached the small table. The younger man tensed, his eyes darting to Father Harper for reassurance. The priest gave him a calm, encouraging nod, and the man exhaled shakily, relaxing just enough to stay seated. The officer pulled out a chair, the wooden legs scraping against the floor, and sat down across from the two men. His posture was stiff, his discomfort evident, but he didn't get up. Father Harper moved to the table, pouring a cup of coffee and placing it in front of the officer. "You said you wanted to see what was behind these doors," Father Harper said, his tone gentle but firm. "Now you're seeing it. These men aren't criminals, they're not threats. They're people just like you, just like me. They have stories. Why don't you listen to them?" The officer hesitated, his hand hovering over the coffee cup. He glanced at the older man, who met his gaze with a steady, almost defiant look. "My name's William," the older man said finally, breaking the silence. "I used to work construction, lost my job after an injury, then lost my house when I couldn't pay the bills. That was 10 years ago. Been on the streets ever since." The younger man spoke next, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Marcus. Got out of foster care at 18 with nowhere to go. Tried to make it on my own, but—" He trailed off, his shoulders slumping. "Life's not as easy as I thought it'd be." The officer's expression softened as he listened, the hard edge in his demeanor giving way to something almost like regret. He nodded slowly, his gaze shifting between the two men. "I didn't know," he murmured almost to himself. Father Harper took a seat as well, folding his hands on the table. "You didn't know," he said, his voice kind but resolute. "But you assumed, and that assumption led you to walk into this church and accuse an entire community of wrongdoing. Do you see the harm in that?" The officer swallowed hard, his face pale. "I do," he said quietly. I was wrong." The room grew silent, the congregation watching with a mix of relief and astonishment. The officer's admission hung in the air, heavy with significance. For the first time since he'd entered the church, he looked less like an enforcer and more like a man. A flawed, vulnerable man capable of growth. The officer sat there, staring down at his untouched coffee, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The room was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden floor as parishioners shifted, waiting for what would happen next. Father Harper leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but resonant, carrying the gravitas of a man deeply rooted in his faith. "Officer," he began, "acknowledging you were wrong is the first step. It's not easy and it takes courage, but understanding why you were wrong is what will change your heart and your actions." The officer looked up, his blue eyes meeting Father Harper's steady gaze. I've let assumptions guide me," he admitted. "I thought I was protecting people, but maybe I wasn't looking at the whole picture. I was afraid." Father Harper nodded, his expression one of compassion. "Fear is powerful. It blinds us, makes us see threats where there are none. But the good news is, we can choose to see differently. Every day, we have the chance to replace fear with understanding, prejudice with empathy." The officer swallowed hard, his throat visibly tightening. He looked around the room, seeing not just faces but lives, people who had come to this church for solace, for guidance, for community. For the first time, he saw them not as strangers, but as human beings. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low but sincere. "To you, Father, to everyone here, I was out of line." The congregation murmured in astonishment, some nodded in approval, others exchanged relieved glances. Father Harper smiled, his warmth radiating through the room. "Apology accepted," he said, "but words must lead to actions, officer. Use your position to build bridges, not walls. Serve with compassion, not suspicion." The officer nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as if a great burden had been lifted. He stood, looking around the room. "I'll do better," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Thank you for this, for everything." Father Harper stood as well, extending his hand. "Go in peace, officer. And remember, this church is open to everyone, including you." The officer shook his hand firmly, his grip lingering as if to convey a silent promise. Then he turned and walked down the hallway, back toward the sanctuary, where the light streaming through the stained glass windows seemed to soften his retreating figure. As the door closed behind him, the congregation erupted into applause, not loud or triumphant, but a gentle, heartfelt expression of support and relief. Father Harper turned to the two men at the table, his smile widening. "And you," he said, addressing William and Marcus, "always remember that you're not alone. This is your home." The younger man wiped at his eyes, nodding silently, while the older man leaned back, his lips curling into a rare, grateful smile. The congregation began to gather around, offering words of encouragement, handshakes, and hugs. For Father Harper, the moment wasn't about victory, it was about transformation. In one afternoon, a seed of change had been planted, not just in the officer, but in everyone who witnessed the encounter. The church, once a place of quiet sanctuary, had become a beacon of resilience, compassion, and hope. And as Father Harper looked out at his congregation, united and stronger than ever, he knew that even in the face of prejudice and fear, love and understanding could prevail.